and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're getting a bit personal, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about diversifying my reading, and we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance. I'm going to start off by saying that I am by no means an expert on the Harlem Renaissance. Part of why I wanted to do this video is because in looking back at my own education, whether it was high school or college, I realized how small a portion of my curriculum was actually devoted to the Harlem Renaissance. And that was something that I wanted to rectify. As I mentioned in my BookTube newbie tag video, the Black Lives Matter movement made me realize that the fact that I was reading and buying books predominantly by white authors, that I was giving publishing a free pass. I think, based on my experience in book publishing before I changed careers, that there is this generalization, this assumption that people aren't interested in reading stories by BIPOC authors. I didn't want my purchasing habits, my reading habits, to give publishing an excuse. It's inexcusable. It's appalling that despite the fact that nearly 40% of the population is BIPOC, only 5% of the books that are published are written by BIPOC author. Although I'm only one person, it's important that I show them, one book at a time, that those stories are worth telling, that people want to read them. In wanting to read more diversely, I was looking at all of those lists that started to appear. Most of them were called something like anti-racism reading list, and there were dozens of books, some of them nonfiction, some of them fiction, recommending that everyone go out and buy these books and read them. And as I was looking through them, preparing to buy them, finding ones that I thought were interesting, and I did buy several, I remember scrolling through Instagram and seeing this Instagram post about Black joy, and how, yes, it's important to do our homework and to read those anti-racism books and understand the history and behaviors and attitudes that have allowed this to continue in 2020. And this Instagram post, which I hope I can find again, basically said, yes, it's important to do that reading and to do that homework, but it's also important to just celebrate Black joy and Black art. And my response, being the history nerd that I am, is to say, well, what better way to celebrate Black joy and Black art but to read books from the Harlem Renaissance? And why did I say that? It was because this 2 to 3-ish decades, from the 1910s to I think the late 1930s, there was this huge explosion of Black culture and art that all came up, that all bubbled out of Harlem in New York City, which is just 50 miles from where I live. And you know what? I didn't actually know all that much about the Harlem Renaissance, which is a huge flaw of the education system. I think everyone knows the name Langston Hughes, but that's the main guy when there's so many other talented authors. So decided to read 2 books from the Harlem Renaissance, but I also wanted to focus on female writers from the Harlem Renaissance because, again, in school, we studied Langston Hughes, we studied County Cullen, and that was really it. So, we're going to start by talking about the books now. The first book and the first author from the Harlem Renaissance that we're going to talk about is Zora Neale Hurston's Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. I will never get that title right. Ever. Zora Neale Hurston. She was actually on a lot of the anti-racism reading list. This book in particular was on the list because it's only recently been published. It is a collection of Zora Neale Hurston's short stories, 8 of which were presumed to have been lost. She has an interesting story. Zora studied anthropology at Barnard and was really interested in Black folk tradition and in the representation of people talking. A lot of the Black authors of her time were very interested in breaking with the stereotypes of uneducated, rural, country bumpkin type Black characters in literature. They wanted to show white America, white readers, that Black Americans could be educated and could be well-spoken, and she kind of subverted those expectations. She was more interested in depicting characters as they were, and so she had a mix of Black characters in her short stories. There were some good guys, there were some bad guys, there were some educated characters, there were some uneducated characters. There were some characters living in Harlem, there were some who were living in small towns in Florida. These stories, they're about everyday life and about families and marriages and small town dynamics and all of that. And her characters were just really came to life. But all the stories in here are very varied and very varied. And I highly recommend picking this collection up if you want an introduction to Zora Neale Hurston or the Harlem Renaissance, or want to read something by someone who Toni Morrison said is one of the greatest writers of our time. So the second book by a female writer of the Harlem Renaissance that I want to talk about is Nella Larsen's Passing. This was a book I'd never heard of. It's a really short novel. It's like 120 pages or so. And I devoured it in an afternoon. It quickly became one of my favorite books ever, just period. I think part of why that is because this book resonates with me on a personal level. Essentially, Passing is a novel about 2 white passing Black women, meaning that they are Black women with light skin. One of these women, Claire, decides that she's going to pass over, which is the term, the expression used in this book to describe a white passing Black woman presenting herself to the rest of the world as white. And Claire goes on to marry a white racist man who she hides her background from. The other character, Irene, is a white passing Black woman who stays within the Black community. She lives in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance with her husband, who she describes in the book as could not exactly pass. It's the story of Claire's loneliness in her deceit and wanting to be a part of the Black community that Irene is in, and of Irene's repulsion and anger at Claire's actions. I think for me, why this resonated is because I am a white passing person of color. My father's family is from Jamaica. His parents, my grandparents, were both born there. I know from going to college, from being in the professional world, basically being in situations where people don't know my background, that people just assume I'm white. And there are certain privileges that come with that other members of my own family don't experience. This book spoke about an experience that I could relate to. I could relate to Claire, who sees the advantages of passing as white. Even Irene at the beginning of the book, like, she goes into a hotel in Chicago to have a drink on a particularly hot day, and she knows that if anyone knew she were a Black woman, she probably wouldn't be allowed to dine there. And it was really the first book I'd read that addressed that. And in addressing that, it addresses colorism in this really authentic way, because Nella Larsen herself is the daughter of a Danish mother and a West Indian father. As I said, as a white passing person of color, it really struck a nerve with me in that I could see myself in the characters. I could see myself in Claire, who passes over for social and financial gain, and understanding that passing as white, being white, you have certain advantages that being a Black person you don't have. On the flip side is that even if you pass, you don't necessarily fit in. Your culture, your experiences are different. This book, it was powerful, and I think it was a really interesting representation of the Black experience, and I think it was a really interesting example of writing from the Harlem Renaissance, because you get a real glimpse into the Harlem Renaissance, into living in Harlem during that time period. If you're interested in getting a better glimpse at the Harlem Renaissance, I would highly recommend both of these books. These two writers are very, very different. The stories they're telling are very, very different. There isn't a singular Black experience, so I think it's important that we seek out as many of them as we can. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I hope I made some sense. I want to thank you for watching, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye!